think it should be working now. Great. Well, welcome everybody to this session on Azure Sentinel. Today I'll be presenting the complete overview. It will be by 2021 new edition, so we'll have new content and new demos for those people that have seen my previous version. And let's get started. We have a lot of ground to cover. So my name is Maarten Goet. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director. And my hobby is actually to fly in the real cloud. I have a pilot's license. And I'm the founder of the non-profit organization Experts Live. So it's a real honor actually to present at one of our big flagship events. So thank you everybody for organizing Experts Live Austria. Now, let's take a step back and see what the current state of the union is. And I guess we need to understand that there is a new world to defend. We have an on-premises world that we have been protecting for the past couple of years. That was largely network-based security we were applying on firewalls, switches, maybe ports, applications and servers. And now that we are moving workloads, servers, applications and infrastructure to the cloud, we see that we need to worry about other things. We get new types of resources like platform services, PaaS services, and that we need to figure out how to defend. We have new connections back into the services, largely, for instance, internet-based traffic. And I think everybody recognizes that for the past 9 months, we've not set a lot of foot on our offices. And so the traditional network-based approach has to change to something that's resilient to the new access methods and also the cloud-based approaches. So we need to adopt, I would say, a cloud defender mindset. If you looked at the on-premises world, you saw that we wanted to protect a server. In the cloud, that would be a service. On-premises, a domain. On cloud, you'd figure out subscriptions, tenant, maybe the tenant you're trying to protect. Domain admin is now more or less the subscription admin who has the highest privileges. Pass the hash now becomes credential pivots or SAMLs. Private IP turn into public IPs largely, and ACLs are now NSGs, Windows application firewalls, other types of security network devices in the cloud. And where you may be focusing on just RDP, SSH, and so forth, access on-prem, in the cloud world, you're really trying to focus on things like management APIs and access to those cloud control planes. So that's the new cloud defender mindset, I would say, that we need to worry about. And everybody recognizes that attacks are accelerating. Just in 2019, some of these research companies found that there was a 95% increase in cost of a breach. And these are US numbers, but still on average, US companies would be impacted for over 5 million based on all of the downtime maybe for factories or other items. With security controls in place, breaches or without security controls in place, security breaches take longer to discover, of course. It's not uncommon that after months, maybe after years, finally on some other incident or maybe a malware that's then triggering, you find that you've been hacked and breached. And with security controls in place, of course, that can be more or less. Increasing number of and sophistication of attacks, because going into the cloud, many more activities need to be inspected and monitored over the next years to make sure that we are in control. Now, of course, we have the option to do nothing, make sure that we don't have an emergency or that we just hope and pray that we don't get breached. But that's, of course, not a very solid plan. So let's have a look at what Microsoft brings you. Well, one of the things that Microsoft brings you is Azure Sentinel. And let's do a brief history. We all know and love Azure Log Analytics. It has been around for a number of years. It's also been provided and used by other services like Azure Monitor, for instance. And based on that work, Microsoft undertook a couple of years ago Project Orion, which led into a preview program called Azure Security Insights, which then turned into Azure Sentinel last year. And with Azure Sentinel, we get a cloud native SIEM. So in Microsoft Azure, there's a new PaaS service, a platform service that brings you a cloud-native SIEM. Why is that interest? Because of the limitless cloud speed and scale. And scale everybody understands, because events coming in, you need storage. And with many events coming in for security, you need a lot of storage, which the cloud offers at a good cost. However, you also need speed, because when you're turning in and starting using machine learning models, you want to quickly use a burst of compute to calculate or respond with machine learning models. And that's something that's hard to do on-prem, because you would need so many more compute capacity. Now Azure Sentinel has machine learning models built in. We'll talk about that in a second. And it has easy integration. It connects with all of the cloud services that you might already be using, like Office 365 and such, but it also easily integrates with other devices and worlds. And of course, it being a cloud service, you just pay for what you use, which is in and by itself interesting. You don't need a big investment up front with storage to make sure you get SIEM capacity. Now, a question I get a lot is, do we still need Azure Security Center? And the answer to that, of course, in my opinion, is yes, because Azure Security Center does a lot more than just focus on security alerting. It brings you workload protection, so it gives you Azure Defender, and certainly if you go for the premium paid version, there's a really interesting way to deploy Azure Defender and get workload protection in things like VMs, but also in Kubernetes clusters, in storage, and etc. And there's just-in-time access, so that you can not publish your ports all the time, but only provide them, for instance, to admins when they need them. It does a good job on the threat protection hence, and of course in compliance there's also a lot of things it offers around getting an insight, an overview into your estate on all of the things that are configured, maybe not configured, and how they apply to certain security control firms like CIS and others. So Azure Security Center is still there, and it would be one of the products you use alongside Azure Sentinel to provide more security, and maybe use the connector to also get those alerts into Azure Sentinel to provide you with a single pane of view. Now that's, I would say, the end goal for Microsoft is to deliver to you some integrated threat protection. Azure Sentinel will be your single pane of view, connecting with our own services like Microsoft 365 Defender, Defender for Identity, Defender for Endpoint and such. It would connect with Azure Defender, like we just said, protecting your cloud workloads, like your servers, VMs in Azure, but also your containers, clusters, IoT. There's now a way to detect and monitor your industrial networks with Azure Defender for IoT and its connector into Azure Sentinel. And of course, all of the third parties and partners that you want to connect, maybe something through Syslog, CEF, maybe Amazon, Google, other clouds that you want to pull into your single cloud native SIEM, and Azure Sentinel allows you to do that. Now, a question we get a lot is how about all of these terminologies on EDR, XDR, and Microsoft Defender, and how does that relate to SIEM, or what's the difference? Well, this is a really high over slide where I'm just trying to reduce it to the key facts, and there's more nuance and detail to provide you, of course, but not enough time in this session to go into that. The XDR and EDR is more focused around protection. For instance, with the new managed Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, you see that we have an EDR block mode, that if there's any pattern that matches with known or even unknown behavior, we can protect it and block it whenever it's occurring before it starts doing even more damage. And it's also focused on incident response. So once you do see some activity, you might want to step in, connect with that endpoint, maybe grab some information, do a forensic image and investigation. Those are things where an XDR really shines and helps you. Now, a SIEM very much shines on the side of collection, making sure that if you want single pane of glass, not just collecting raw events, but maybe collecting signals so that you can do your use case investigations, and then provide you with means to do that detection, maybe correlate across estates, and then investigate and give you all the reach you need to step into other products and maybe do some advanced hunting. So XDR complements, I would say, the SIEM world, and ideally you would have both to have a strong security posture. Now, the architecture of Azure Sentinel is quite straightforward. We're using Microsoft Azure, the platform you already know and love, and all of the things that happen there. So all the secure identities that Microsoft Azure has is something that you get because Azure Sentinel is a PaaS service in Microsoft Azure. It uses log analytics, like we just talked about. It is something you enable in a log analytics workspace, and then you can work with the Sentinel features and functionality. And the question I get a lot is, do I reuse my current log analytics workspace? Do I need to create a new one, or do I need to rationalize back from a number of workspaces into one? Those are all of things I've written down in a design considerations blog. And if you want to know more about it, you should definitely check out my blog. Now, Azure Sentinel is enabled on the log analytics workspace. And then you can use things like KQL, the Kusta query language, to do analytics, detections, investigations, and hunting, and so forth. Now, the next step you'll probably do from the point of deployment is connecting log sources and alerts and signals into Azure Sentinel. And this is just a brief number of connectors that we have. There's way, way more. There's over 60 by this point in time, and more get added pretty much every month. You can connect your Azure AD Identity Protection, your MCAS, Azure Security Center we just talked about, or things like Microsoft Defender for Identity, but certainly also networking equipment like Palo Alto, Cisco, Barracuda, and more. Some of the big cloud services like Office 365, and some of the other endpoint solutions like Symantec and whatnot. So really something that allows you to get to this single pane of glass. Now, these connectors not only bring in data or signals, they also give you analytic rules. And these analytic rules will work with the data that flows in, trigger on a certain aspect, and give you information on a certain event that's happening. Now, the interesting part is they can be scheduled, looking at data, and periodically they can be at ingestion time. They can be signals that are already processed in other products like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and you'll just get the signal. But there's also the option to apply machine learning models, which is called Fusion. We'll talk about that in a second. And then these analytic rules are out of the box mapped to some of the MITRE attack tactics. Too much to go into detail for now, but giving you information about which phase of the attack kill chain we think this is happening in, and what information you get more out of the box from there. And of course, you can create your own analytic rules and go out and from an empty, maybe KQL query, start building your own. You also get workbooks. So Azure Workbooks is a way to visualize and help you drill down in certain information. And these connector packages will give you Azure Workbooks out of the box. But again, there's the option to build some of your own. Maybe do an investigative workbook, look at certain IP addresses, certain accounts, certain maps, and then drill down into more information. And interestingly enough, this is really helpful because as an analyst, you need your cognitive skills to really quickly find information. If you are presented with 1,000 rows of records and information, that's harder to process than certain visual aspects where you're starting to draw into certain areas of that information and quickly come to a conclusion of what to do next. So workbooks really assist you, of course, in the investigative and alerting phase. Now, of course, the investigation in and by itself is also visual. We have a really neat investigation UI that you can take from any point of view, going from a query, going from an alert, or maybe a hunt that you're doing. You get presented in a visual way all of the items involved, all of the relationships, information about those resources. But personal favorite of mine is the timeline, so that you quickly see all of the steps that are being taken chronologically, potentially by an adversary or a hacker. And again, from there you can drill down and go any way you'd like it to go. Now, the hunting is something where Azure Sentinel provides you with hunting queries for automated investigation. They've already drawn up the KQL queries that are needed, for instance, to I don't know, look at nested RDPs or other things that you're interested in because your investigation draws you into that area. You can certainly also then run them at scale, give you information about when you run all of the hunting queries, did one of them trigger, and do you want to investigate more from there? There's bookmarks to keep tabs on findings. So if you find something, you can earmark it and bookmark it to come back to, or maybe list them one by one once you start concluding your findings. There's a query explorer, of course, from Log Analytics to do some of the manual hunting from the Azure portal and such. And of course, we have capabilities to do the advanced hunting. And that's something where there's often a lot of discussion on what's hunting, what's investigation, what's automation, where do I find what? Well, if you look at a typical security operations center, I would say that the first line of defense against all of the alerts coming in is your automation and trying to filter out, maybe through correlation, what things are of interest and what are not of interest. You typically see a tier one, then a combination of both automated, maybe task-based handling, maybe some manual interaction by person, where you do some high-speed remediation to come to true positives. But when you do find a true positive, the typical tier 2 and tier 3 people start to get engaged. And that's typically where you see advanced hunting appear. There's already been some sort of investigation. There's already the conclusion that this is possibly a true positive, and we need to get more context about this problem and alert that's occurring. So that, to me, is what advanced hunting is. And Robert Lee from Dragos, which is a great company in and by itself, summarizes it in this way: hunting starts where automation ends. And I could wholeheartedly undescribe that. So what you then typically see is Jupyter notebooks. Jupyter notebooks is a combination of code you can run within the notebook, often Python based, but there's also kernels for PowerShell and others, with annotations, so with Markdown and other features to keep tabs, and functionality behind the scenes, maybe a Jupyter notebook server that allows you to share information with your hunting colleagues, or maybe with your customer or any stakeholder in the process. And this is something you can do with Jupyter. Now you can bring your own instance, run Jupyter on your laptop, maybe run a server somewhere. But you could certainly also look at Azure ML, machine learning services, to host the Jupyter instance for you, and then just work with the data from the cloud and have no endpoint concerns. This is ideal for complex investigation, but there is a bit of a learning curve. So not everybody is already proficient in using Jupyter. But it is also really ideal for sharing information with others. And Azure Sentinel delivers out-of-the-box notebooks. So if you're not, if you don't know how to create a notebook, then just take one of the examples, and you'd be amazed on all of the power you get from Jupyter. And I'll demo it later in this session. Now there's much more. Like we told, there's MITRE ATT&CK mapping from alerts and some other views. Through Ignite last year, the threat intelligence platform features were announced. And this is interesting because we can then also start using Azure Sentinel as our TI platform, getting indicators of compromise, let's say IP addresses, hashes, and URLs or other things into the platform that we can then correlate against maybe analytic rules, use cases, or other products that we're using. It can also easily connect with things like MISP and so forth. So it's been a really powerful threat intelligence feature that you get now out of the box in Azure Sentinel. There's watch lists. And watch lists, I'll give you an example. Maybe there's an analytic rule where you want to trigger based on odd and outlying login information, maybe from other countries, other IP addresses, other geographies. But maybe you want to exclude the office locations you have, or maybe some of the other locations you have for which you know the IP address. Then noting all of those IP addresses into a watch list, and then just referring to that watch list from an analytic rule allows you to create that flexibility that they will be excluded from triggering alerts. And having it in a watch list then allows you to update the watch list without having to update all of these external things like KQR queries and whatnot. So the maintenance goes down, and it's a feature we really needed to make sure this is rock solid. One other great rock solid feature would be Playbooks, responding to alerts, if I would summarize it. You get some of these alerts, you want to maybe respond with blocking a user account, maybe triggering a password reset. Maybe you want to grab some extra information based on the alert that then allows you to automate more to come to the conclusion or false positive or true positive. Now, a Playbook in essence is a logic app, an Azure logic app that you can trigger from alerts that get created, but also manually when you're doing investigations or hunting. So we see a lot of companies now creating playbooks that respond to some of the alerts they've been using for creating for their enterprise. One of the newest features is also the UEBA, the entity behavior. Maybe you want to zoom in on what a certain admin is doing or what a certain host is happening. Then you could do an entity-focused view, log in there, get information about alerts happening, but also information on current metrics, on statistics, on all sorts of things that are based on behavior. And this is in and by itself a different session, but a really powerful feature for sure. Azure Sentinel has an active GitHub repo where you can find new analytic rules that get submitted by Microsoft themselves or by third parties like MVPs, other community members. It has a feature, of course, I would say, on ingesting syslog and comment event formats, specifically often for network-based devices. If you don't have an endpoint solution, we've seen customers deploy Sysmon and grabbing information from Sysmon into Azure Sentinel and working with those, and that's also quite powerful. And you should definitely check out Olaf Hartong's blogs and information about this. He's been doing great work on this, as well as Eduardo. There's the option to work with Logstash. Again, a bit maybe too advanced for this session, but a powerful method to ingest pretty much anything you have in your infrastructure and get that into Azure Sentinel for correlation. And the list would go on and on, so I've not completed the full list, but you can imagine there's so much more things to talk about. Now let's talk no more. Let's do a quick demo. Let me get this screen here. Good. So this is my demo environment, my Microsoft Azure demo environment, and I've logged in and ahead of time in the past 2 months created an Azure Sentinel instance, a log analytics workspace. Let me do a refresh of the page real quick. Here we go. Not sure why this is taking a couple of seconds. Maybe switch back to something else. Yeah. Let me check if I still have my roles enabled. Active assignments. Got it. Active assignments. Got it. All right. Here we go. This is my Azure Sentinel workspace. Typically when you go into Azure Sentinel, it brings you to the overview page for the last 24 hours, and I'll switch back to November 1st to give you some...
You're muted right now.
Okay, somebody muted me. Now I'm in the Azure Sentinel overview page. I've set it back to November 1st, so we have 2 months of data, and we see a statistic about the events and alerts that happened over time. We get information about the data source anomalies, so we see some really big uptakes in Azure activities over the last 2 months, and we see a link to the machine learning services. Now, typically when you've set up Azure Sentinel, you would go into data connectors, and from data connectors, you would start enabling data connectors. And as you can see, I've got 14 data connectors enabled, and at this point in time, there's about 63 connectors available, and that's a lot. Every couple of weeks, you see more and more. There's a couple of free ones, like for instance, the Azure Activity one we just saw from the anomalies. And the Azure Activity one allows you to grab those events, and you see here on the right hand side it also comes with 2 workbooks, 2 queries for log analytic rules, for hunting queries, and 8 analytic rules. We can open the connector page, for instance, and we see that this has been configured for the number of subscriptions that we have. If we go, for instance, to Office 365, we get the same information, some workbooks and analytic rules we get, and we can just check mark the things we want to get into Azure Sentinel. But also, like we said, there's generic ones like the syslog one if you want to connect your networking equipment. But we do have set ones. If you are running, for instance, Palo Alto, you can just follow this wizard to make sure you deploy all of the things you need to ingest that data. So really easy to get this in. If we go to those analytic rules, and I'll first start off with the rule templates tab, you see that there's a ton of rules that we get out of the box. The list goes on and on and on and on. And let's search for one. Let's say we want to look for anything on PowerShell Empire. We see that we get one of those out of the box, PowerShell Empire commandlets that it can detect. It gives you information on which table to work with. So once you start ingesting security events, Azure Sentinel can trigger. It maps back to the execution and persistent phase of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And you see, for instance, here the KQL that Microsoft has drafted that you can just use or maybe tailor if you need to tailor it for your environment. Just click the create rule template or button, and it takes the template through a number of easy steps into the active rule. Now, if you're more concerned about certain, let's say, MITRE ATT&CK phases, you can also just use the drop down and say, well, give me anything on lateral movement. I'll hit OK. And it gives you information on things that it would then detect. I've imported one about RDP nesting, maybe rare RDP connection. So these are things you get from Azure Sentinel out of the box. And again, there's a GitHub repo that you can use to extend these. And there's also parties that can create use cases for you and have often use case libraries. Now these analytics will trigger and then potentially give you incidents. And in this case, you see that there's a number of things that happened in my environment. Reverse shell was found, some suspicious malware. And of course, we've created these test events ahead of time to make sure you see the power of Azure Sentinel. So let's take one, maybe the suspicious process injection. It gives you information, medium alert, some of the entities involved, detective, it looks like a defense evasion, and we can just click investigate. Now the investigation will take us into a visual approach. We see that here. We see that it was the user COS. Apparently a Notepad is involved, PowerShell is involved, and I can just click on entities, for instance, to get information on things happening, maybe some of the SHA hashes, and I can also have a look at timeline. Now this is just one, but maybe if we click on COS, we get a pop-up saying give me the related alerts. So let's see what COS has been up to, and it looks into the backend and gets, if I'm correct, 2 or 3 other alerts based on the demo we did. Yep, here we go. Now again, we can do this visually. There's some suspicious sequence. There's a block test. Let me position this. But if we go to timeline, and again, this is a really powerful feature, we now see there was a suspicious process injection, which then led to a suspicious sequence of exploration, potential lateral movement, then some unexpected behavior by a rare process, and then something we blocked. So this is already something of concern, and of course now you would be start triggering a true positive and maybe doing the hunt. Now if you go to entities, we see really interesting information. Let's say we want to know more about the unexpected behavior. then we see this information, but we also see, for instance, an alert link. And the alert link, let me try and capture this one. Here we go. Brings us into, I hope this copy and paste worked. Brings us into Microsoft Defender for endpoints, which actually triggered this event. Nope. Let me do a new one. Yeah, here we go. Paste the right URL. Then we actually get taken directly into that more detailed event into Microsoft Defender for endpoint. We see a process tree, which is really powerful because now we understand that it was triggered from PowerShell, and that we see it being blocked by the MC inspection. And we can see it's a multi-stage incident, and there's some techniques involved, for instance, the process hollowing, which is quite new. And then you can click on a link into MITRE ATT&CK framework pages that gives you information on what this could be and how this is relating to your problem. So really powerful and tying the XDR back into your SIM, I would say. Now this next step would be potentially to undertake some steps to mitigate. Maybe you want to investigate more, maybe you want to block something, maybe you want to lock this user, this endpoint. And again, this is where Playbooks come in. These are again Azure Logic apps, and in this case you could just say I want to kill that suspicious process, maybe from the alert triggering directly step in, or maybe for instance because you're in an investigation and now the analyst wants to undertake some of these things. There's also a community tab. So when I'm in the Azure Community tab, I can click on go to Azure Sentinel Community, and that takes me to GitHub, the Azure Sentinel community, and you see there's all sorts of dashboards, data connectors, detection, explorations, parsers, sample data, notebooks, etc. that you can take, but that you can also contribute to. Here on the right-hand side, you see there's a large community of people actually contributing, about 187 people at this point. So very, very active. And if you need any resolutions for this year, things to do, then we'd welcome you to help out and start building stuff for Azure Sentinel that makes us all, I guess, more safe. And of course, there's information on the threat intelligence platform. We talked about that for a second. There's the entity behavior. Again, we talked about that. We can zoom into certain accounts. Let's do last 30 days. And we see certain people and hosts popping up, for instance, like COS, and that will dive us into a centric information about those hosts. And again, those notebooks, but we'll be taking that in a separate chapter in a second. For now, let's look at the hunting queries. These are the things you get out of the box. And if we want to investigate more on anomalous, let's say, RDP activity, I can just say, run this query. And it will say, well, there's actually two anomalous RDP activities. We click on view results. And that gives us the KQL query that it actually ran behind the scenes. And you would also see the outcome in a couple of seconds, giving the clues for you to investigate further on. Let's expand one of those. And not sure why it's funky, but it gives information on a remote interactive login from a certain IP address. This would be my ISP, and so I guess it triggered because of all of the normal connectivity it would normally have, and these two are outliers that you can then investigate. Now let's go back to the slides. So a question you might have is, well, this is only then for Microsoft products and services. Well, my answer would be this. No, that's a joke, of course. There's all sorts of other worlds we can connect into Azure Sentinel. And certainly Azure Sentinel loves AWS. We can bring the full power of our cloud native SIEM with advanced hunting to your Amazon AWS enterprise and combine them again to achieve a single pane of view. We have a built-in Amazon AWS connector. You can enable it from the connectors page. You can leverage your current AWS CloudTrail deployment. So if you are already auditing events in your platform, then you can just take that information from your current AWS CloudTrail and send it into Azure Sentinel. We only need, of course, the read-only access, the IAM policy to get those audit events for CloudTrail, and you then get an AWS CloudTrail table in Azure Sentinel, and you can do some of the manual investigations, hunting, create workbooks, but you do get a couple of them out of the box, as you see here in the page, a couple of workbooks, hunting queries, and alerts that actually also correlate across, and I'll show you that in a second in Azure Sentinel. Now the connector itself is free. At this point you just pay for the storage that's underlying, is what I've understood. Now the hunting queries are quite fascinating because they do zoom in on the things happening in the AWS platform, maybe some of the outliers or maybe some of the changes, like changes to your Elastic load balancers. But it also maps information across, so failed Azure AD logins, but then a successful login to the AWS console with that same identity. So that actually correlates information from both connectors and then gives you an alert, which is quite powerful. And these are the things you can just enable out of the box, or perhaps investigate more when you need it. And again, those workbooks maybe zoom in on certain regions, understand what's happening where, zoom into certain users or resources that deserve that intention. Now there is a specific attack, MITRE ATT&CK matrix for AWS, and this is an excerpt of it, and I've tried to map back what coverage you get out of the box. So there are hunting queries that you get, there are analytic rules, and we actually cover quite a bit, as you can see, from the various phases of the kill chain. So it's a powerful thing. If you have a multi-cloud strategy, then make sure you attach Azure Sentinel to it and get at least a single pane of glass, because going into 10 products will not make you safer. Now we've highlighted it in the beginning of the presentation, but let's talk about those use cases. What in my definition is a use case is 2 or more signals combined that then give you an holistic and more context view. So let's take this example. At 9:13 we see an unusual login that's done from Kazakhstan, which in and by itself can be suspicious, but it could also be somebody traveling there. Once you get one alert and one signal, it's hard to do the triage. You need more information to get to a conclusion of true or false positive, because if you're just seeing unusual login, you don't know why or that it's part of something bigger. Now maybe you have a second signal, maybe your network equipment is alerting you that some Tor exit activity was found from that same IP address that did the unusual login, and maybe you found a potential suspicious PowerShell script that got executed from, let's say, Defender for endpoint. And then you see from Defender for Office 365 an inbox forwarding rule created and all sorts of data going out to Gmail. Of course, combining these 4 signals will give you a very strong conclusion that this is a true positive, that this is a priority 1, that you need to step in and investigate and start taking action. And this is possibly a data exfiltration. So a use case would be something for 2 or more signals combined, making a really strong case for quick triage and responses. This is an example, like I just told, a compromised account leading to Office 365 mailbox exfiltration with all of the data combined from those alerts and signals. Now you might be wondering, if you have one Sentinel instance, all sorts of analytics, rules and such that you need to maintain, watch lists that you need to maintain, maybe backups you want to create of your environment and so forth. Then I want to point out that we have published an Azure Sentinel PowerShell module for free that you can take from the Wortel GitHub repository, and it allows you to programmatically interface with Azure Sentinel and even come as far as building a CI/CD pipeline for use cases or even the infrastructure and connectors that you're using in your environment or for that of your customers. Now switch gears and come to machine learning a bit. As said, it's built in and it's branded as Azure Sentinel Fusion because it fuses different alerts and signals together in a machine learning model and comes to a conclusion. It's enabled by default. You don't need to enable it in your workspace. It's enabled by default. You just need to enable certain models that you want to use or don't use. In October 2020, so roughly 2-3 months ago, 32 new fusion detections were released. So Microsoft is innovating quite a bit on this area. But there's also the possibility to bring and create your own machine learning models. It has a bit of a learning curve, of course, because you need to understand how to do. But in the near future, I'll be publishing a blog post with a step-by-step on how to do it. And of course, at this point, there's Microsoft Docs, and there's some samples on GitHub that you can take, which involves setting up an Azure Databricks cluster. Now, Azure Fusion is built on all of the expertise that Microsoft has on other estates, like Office 365. Of course, they've been running that at scale. So detection from multiple security products like network events, identities, mailboxes, and endpoints that then are formed into graphs and reduced by probabilistic kill chain machine learning models into a reasonable amount of incidents. And then these incidents are scored by a machine learning model based on priority, which reduces it even further to just the number of alerts and incidents that really matter and should be taken action upon. Again, going back to the analytics rules templates in the product, you just take, for instance, the advanced multi-stage attack detection. You click enable, it's enabled by default. And once you have those data sources, so in this example, you'll see Azure Active Directory, Identity Protection, and MCAS as the two sources. Once you have those data connectors up and running, you'll be set and it will work for you and give you alerts based on these 4 tactics that you see here above. Now, one of the really great assets that Microsoft has is what I think the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, MYSTIC. I saw on the internet it's described as the gatekeeper to the security of Microsoft, its services and partners. Seems like a mission statement. But to me, it's an elite team with lots of industry experts. They've been hiring so many great people over the past months. It's been amazing. And it's led by John Lambert, a distinguished engineer that has been around for a while and has been doing really great work with his team. Some of the team focuses on nation state stuff, really nice stuff that we read about in books, I would say, and APT research, but there's also part of the house that's working on all of the things we get in Azure Sentinel and the other products. They publish hunting information, code, tools, and whatnot, and you find that in Azure Sentinel, and you can benefit from that information and knowledge they have and real-world experience by just starting to use Azure Sentinel, I would say. Now let's look at a recent attack, and I guess I'm been putting on some big shoes here because the SolarWinds attack has not been unraveled fully yet. It keeps growing and growing, the information, but as you've probably all learned and read about is SolarWinds was breached late last year, an attack believed to be carried out by the Russians. What we know at this point is that SolarWinds build server was breached, the JetBrains software they're using, and I saw a tweet from Kevin Beaumont in the past days on how JetBrains works with enabling SMB v1, having PSExec on your build server and stuff. That was quite disturbing. But through that breach, they were unknowingly distributing a backdoor in their software and came in through all sorts of government agencies, private companies, and at this point, people believe it's been over 250 agencies and businesses that have been attacked. But through Microsoft's last blog, we see that the end goal of the SolarWinds supply chain compromise was to pivot to the victim's cloud. They were trying to steal some of the SAML tokens and then getting access to some of the cloud resources those companies and agencies have, which is, of course, very disturbing. Now, looking at a short timeline, we see that the earliest record domain registration was in August 2019. And again, this is based on a blog I found at Palo Alto. The earliest identified modification of the Orion software code was around October last year. They acquired a certain domain that has then been frequently used in their C2 channel, the command and control channel. You see some first SSL certificates around February, and then weaponizing those software updates to get into those agencies and companies. In December, just before Christmas, FireEye reported, and SolarWinds published their advisory, and Microsoft seized their Sunburst, Solorigate, all acronyms for the same thing, C2 domain, which stopped some of that attack, of course. So the question you might have is, okay, that's a recent attack. How would Azure Sentinel help? Well, Microsoft has published a ton of hunting information on getting information if you in your enterprise and network were attacked. We got new analytic rules in Azure Sentinel. Again, the power of a cloud SIEM. You don't need to do anything. Those will pop up in your SIEM and you can just enable them. There's been a comprehensive workbook, and we'll look at that in a second. Jupyter notebook, I must say, that's published that you can then use, and a workbook for overview and visually showing that information. And of course, the KQL queries that are underlying behind all of this that give you all of the queries and investigation power to see if it happened to your environment. So let's switch to a demo. If I go back to, okay, here we go, to the analytic rules. And I think the tactics have been selected all. And I search for Solorigate, yeah, here we go, which is again one of the names that this breach has got. Then we see that we can create an analytic rule for the network beacons that are described in this blog that you see here above. We can click on that blog, get an instant access to FireEye's information, and the same goes for Microsoft blog, so this is really, really helpful. We see which data sources we can leverage, the DNS, Cisco, Palo Alto, Microsoft 365 Defender, and again we can detect the C2 channel. We also see the KQL query, and we can just enable it. The same goes for Defender detections. So if you have Microsoft Defender and you want to make sure that some of these things get detected from initial access, you could just enable it. The same goes for hunting. So Solorigate, we can hunt for certain DNS patterns, maybe historically look at the last month or last year, however long you've been preserving data, or maybe search for things like the encoded domain, that's the encoding that's part in the traffic they've been sending up and forth. So these are things you just get out of the box, no need to do anything. And again, going into the advanced hunting, maybe you're triggered and you want to understand more about your environment. Then Microsoft published this guided investigation, the SolarWinds post-compromise Jupyter notebook. Now, if I just launch the notebook, it will take me to Azure ML services, and based on that instance, launch the Jupyter notebook. You can do it there, but for speed purposes in my demo, I've actually hosted a local Jupyter server on this machine. I'll open up the workbook. Let's first open a Finder, go to GitHub. I've cloned the repositories. So in this case, we see there's a SolarWinds Jupyter notebooks, and we can see that from the fact that there is an extension of IPYNB because it was previously called IPython notebooks, but let's not worry about that yet. Going into Visual Studio Code, a really easy way to use Jupyter notebooks. I'll grab the Jupyter notebook here. It starts the Jupyter server locally and gives me, in this case, some markdown, some information about how does this notebook work, some references how to use it, the initialization, and there's a big part on initializing it for your workspace to connect to it. I've done that, of course, ahead of time. It then unzips all of the KQL queries it needs, and I'll scroll down a bit. It then brings us to a part called IOC Hunt, and I can start to hunt for each and any of those queries. So it gives me information on, did we see teardrop memory only dropper? Did we see backdoor hashes? Did we see a network beacons? Did we see child processes, etc., etc.? These are all blank, luckily, so in my environment no Russian adversaries. But scrolling a bit down to some more of the generic information, we see that one triggered. This collected data and gave me back one row. And what it was the addition of new key credentials to a service principal. This is the query, quite advanced. And if we look a bit more, we see information about this credential. And we see that it's called Jupiter. And I actually created that, of course, to trigger this notebook. But this would lead to an investigation for this credential, maybe block it or do something else. So you can go through this workbook. You can automate it by using some of the steps here in a really, really powerful way, because this then allows me to share this information quickly with colleagues. So this is how Azure Sentinel helps, I would say, with Solorigate. So what can you do today? Well, understand the common attack techniques. What are the things that are low-hanging fruit and things that could happen to your environment? It's really not uncommon to see a lot of RDP brute forces still as an entry point into breaches. There's commodity malware that still triggers and helps them spread some of the things they need in their further attacks. There's credential theft, like we just learned about in SolarWinds, where they're trying to attack SAML, but certainly pass the hash is still interesting. Now you need to figure out, what do I need to do about defenses? I've listed a couple of them here on the right-hand side, quick wins you could do to really, really harden and optimize your environment. Again, low-hanging fruit, security updates still needed, but start using things like threat and vulnerability management from Microsoft Defender and other products. Apply MFA, analyze logon events, use tamper protection, use attack surface reduction rules. These slides will be made available to you, as well as the recording. So maybe a good idea in your environment to start looking at if you've done these steps, and if not, maybe make a plan on how to start completing them. There's also a great Microsoft Learn section on the Microsoft.com website on learning how to operate Azure Sentinel. There's a ton of modules you can take about security incident management, threat detection, deployment. It has about 8 modules at this point, so have a look at the learning path if you want to understand more. If you're not proficient yet in KQL, that's fine. Go to Pluralsight. Robert Kane made a wonderful course on learning KQL from scratch. It goes from just getting data to all of the advanced operators in just, I think, 3.5 hours of content, which is really, really awesome and often available for free. So have a look at Pluralsight if you want to learn KQL. And that makes that Microsoft is really investing a lot in security. Make no mistake, is what Josh says. Microsoft is a security company now, and I think we're all starting to see it. They're doing a really, really good job in Microsoft security. Now, I can imagine that hearing all of this makes you wonder, like, how do I handle this all? How do I operate a 24/7 follow-up of all of the things happening? Well, talk to your MSSP. Like we have at Wortel Enterprise Security, we run a 24/7 managed detection and response service. Have it operate for you. Often easy rates to make sure that you start doing the detections, that you can just use Azure Sentinel from the MSSP with their use case libraries and their crew and automation, and make sure that you get security even when you're sleeping. So ask your MSSP today maybe to operate it on behalf of you, would be a great option. Want to know more about all of the technical nitty-gritty details? I've published an Azure Sentinel ebook. It's on the Wortel website for free. Gives you detailed information on what I just talked about, over 100 pages of technical information for you to consume. And I'm running a blog on maartengoet.org and running a podcast on securityinsiders.io. Here it is. And we'll be coming out with a new season this year with all sorts of great people giving you insights, for instance, on how Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center runs behind the scenes. So with that, thank you to all the sponsors. Without them, it wouldn't be possible to do this. And thank you for tuning